Hello class, this is Jim Gilliland. I'm in COMS 526 B01 and looking forward to spending this time with you. One of the things I was told in my last video was the quality of the audio wasn't very good. I hope it is improving, but in the process of doing that I've noticed that now this quality video is showing all of my warts, and this old face is pretty old and been through a lot of briar patches, so forgive me. Of course, you all aren't going to be looking at the face. You're going to be looking at the PowerPoint, which you need to have already put up and queued up. First thing, if you looked at all the slides and you're putting all those slides together and thinking about a guy who's been around a while, you're going to think this presentation's long. I'm trying very hard to keep it short, but Catmull, chapter 12, oh my goodness. I am so jacked up about this chapter. Most of my career has been in the field of starting, fixing, and changing, and applying my marketing and journalism and marketing communication skills, crisis communication skills, issue management to help companies who are going through mergers and acquisitions. So I was immediately drawn to this. Sidebar. We need to pray for the people who are in Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, as Hurricane Matthew is coming up the coast right now. We need to be concerned for them and reach out to them in our prayers for safety and cooperation on the ground. Okay, I've had my ADD moment. Thank you. Chapter 12. The first slide that you have up, I just wanted to kind of frame it a little bit. As I was reading this chapter, Barbara Streisand was coming to my mind. She sang a song a long time ago called Putting It Together. The art of making art is putting it together, bit by bit, piece by piece, part by part. It was so great. So this chapter reminds me so much of that song, and I really enjoyed looking in, kind of pulling the layers back on a business of animated movies. My wife won't look at just about anything but animated movies anymore. So now we have a particular insight into that a lot more. So Catmull chapter 12, second slide. Disney, Pixar, two iconic entities in creating animated theater for us to watch. Many of us have watched Disney through the years, all the way back to Snow White. Others of us have been introduced through Pixar and their 3D animation and the significance of that. If you look on the slide, you'll see, can what Catmull talks about in this chapter be universally applied? As I was reading about this, I was thinking to myself, can this only work in a creative environment, or is it going to work in all industries and all situations in pieces and parts, or is it only unique to this industry? Because Ed did a marvelous job of describing his business and what business he was in, and the recognition early on that being in the hardware animated business wasn't working for them, and they made a decision, of course, to go into software. So that's a key thing as I look at this in chapter 12. Next slide. I am thinking about selling Pixar to Disney. That's what Steve Jobs said to John Lasseter and Ed Catmull. Well, you can imagine all the work they had done at Pixar to create this unique way of producing and creating movies that are animated. So here comes Steve Jobs, who had been feeding his money into this company for years, and he's saying he wants to sell to the big Goliath in the animated business. So naturally, their simultaneous response, according to the book, was, "You're what?" They were in shock, but I think they learned something about that. So, I kind of asked the question, he did the unthinkable in their minds, but was Steve Jobs selling in or selling out, or was he selling up? The next slide. Why this and why now? Pixar, according to Steve, needed a marketing and distribution partner. And right now, he said to them, Pixar is a yacht. He said, but a merger will put us on a giant ocean. In other words, they'll be so large that they can withstand the waves and the tides and the elements in a way that could make a difference. Why this? Why now? Two reasons he gave. He said we needed a marketing and distribution partner. He knew that Pixar didn't have the channels in place from a marketing perspective to deliver the great product that they were producing. And he said what he said, Pixar is a yacht. So when you analyze these reasons in retrospect, it helps us to see a side of Steve Jobs that we may not get to see through the optics of Apple and all the Apple lore. I've always been interested, as you all probably have, about how he was perceived as a just indignant, arrogant intellectual who didn't take anything off anybody. And he probably was that at Apple. And to a certain extent, he was that way with Ed Catmull and John Lasseter. So perhaps for John and Ed, they had that fear of change and randomness. I know, Mia, you talked about that, change and randomness and hidden pieces and parts. Maybe they had a little bit of that fear and anxiety as Steve Jobs brought this idea to them. And there's also the sidebar here. Visionary leaders can disagree and still show respect and value with what they disagree with. You know, Steve Jobs didn't like the marketing people at Disney, but he recognized that even though he didn't like them, he knew they knew more than his folks did. That takes a real kind of visionary and takes someone who has an open thinking style. And I've encountered that in my own life when I've worked with other clients. You can always tell those who are kind of stuck and don't want to, give up what they have. So Ed's story on page 244 about how Steve Jobs disagreed with Disney's marketing folks is something I would point out to you. And that sidebar, I think, makes that point very well. So, next slide. Picture of the four dudes, not the three amigos, but the four dudes. You have John Lasseter on the far left, Steve Jobs, Bob Iger, who is the head of Disney at that time, and Ed Catmull. What did Steve Jobs say to John and to Ed? He said, "Get to know Bob Iger. That's all I ask. He's a good man." What an interesting thing to be said by Steve Jobs about another man. So the first thing Bob Iger, did when he met with Ed Catmull was he told him a story. He told him a story about being in Hong Kong and watching the parade of characters and noticing the characters that had been coming by most recently were the classic ones, Buzz Lightyear and Toy Story. Those characters were going by, and he realized those were the last characters in animation, and nobody in Disney was producing those. And that's where he got the germ of the idea. So much is in play there. You got Bob Iger, who is the head of an entertainment organization, and he's so attentive to detail that it triggers the thought and the process in his mind of, maybe we need to go find a company that can help us keep doing that, which ultimately is what he did. He was a visionary leader too. So you have Steve Jobs, who was a vision caster, Bob Iger, who was a visionary, and he got that genesis, that idea. He said specifically, "It occurred to me that the only classic characters that had been created in the past 10 years were Pixar characters." What a testimony to Ed Catmull and John Lasseter's team at Pixar. Ed Catmull also observed that Iger asked questions rather than hold forth. Some leaders pontificate and they want to go and say what they want to say, and they think everybody wants to hear them. But the best leaders, I think, in my life, in my experience, they ask questions. They pursue knowledge and learning, and then they do the assimilation and the introspection on their own. I think that's significant. So was this an acquisition, a merger, or was it a concession agreement? Ed kept referring to this as a merger in one situation, and then he referred to it as an acquisition in another. I think that's a mixture maybe of some legal terms, but Catmull calls this an acquisition and merger, and in the same sentence on page 245, he says that. I think that is telling. Legally, it was an acquisition, but operationally, it was a merger. Next slide. Ed and John in charge of Pixar and Disney Animation. So before they perfected the sale, Steve Jobs negotiated with Bob Iger that John and Ed had to be the head of the entire company. So think about that. Disney Animation had previously been reporting to someone else. Now they're reporting to John and Ed. This was a rare opportunity to take ideas from one creative culture and try to apply them to another creative culture. And I think this is significant in chapter 12 because Ed and John both had a childhood love for Disney. And so the opportunity to come in and be part of bringing Disney back to its former glory just really energized them. Next slide. So what's their challenge? To keep Pixar healthy while making Disney animation great again. That, simply put, was the challenge they had before them. So, next slide. Fork in the road. I couldn't decide whether to use the traditional fork in the road or the more abstract fork in the road, so that's why you see that. It represents two ideas, two companies being separate but operating, but equal, but operating separately. What would the relationship between the two studios really be like? What would they have to do? What we have to do is make people at Disney Animation feel like they haven't lost. It's a typo in my slide, sorry. That's what Steve Jobs said to Ed Catmull. He said, what we have to do is not make the people at Disney Animation feel like they are the losers in this acquisition and in this merger. Very perceptive on the part of Steve and very perceptive on recognizing that Ed Catmull and John Lasseter could pick up on that. The next slide. 5-year social compact. 7 pages, single-spaced, 59 bullets. You try to say that 3 times. 7 pages, single-spaced, 59 bullets. 7 pages, single-spaced, 59 bullets. I can't do it but just twice. So here's the thing. Ed and John believed that what they had to do was preserve Pixar as they were learning how to operate Disney Animation. So he wanted to put in place a 5-year social compact that protected what they perceived the values and the policies that made Pixar unique and successful. So that was going to take, I think, that's a key piece of how you start to transfer culture, but you protect the culture that you have. So this was all about Pixar. What's interesting is Steve Jobs, Ed Catmull, and John Lasseter considered this to be a prerequisite to finalizing the sale, and they were willing to stand on that. What's more impressive is that Bob Iger agreed to it. He understood, I think Bob did, what creative people needed to do was have lots of space. And given the fact that they had been successful and had a great production output and successful feature films, I think he was willing to give them that social compact. It was interesting to me some of the things that were on that social compact. First of all, Pixar executive team could reward employees with bonuses. That's interesting because in this day and time, a lot of people just, hey, it shows up in your automatic deposit in your bank statement. These guys took hard checks with letters and walked around to every employee. They had 800 employees. When they would do well in a movie like Toy Story 2 or Toy Story or any of those kinds of productions, once the results came back and the movie was successful, they would let them have a bonus and they would deliver those bonuses to them. No assigned parking. You know, it's always an interesting thing when you pull up to a company and there's a sign out there that says parking reserved for so-and-so vice president or parking reserved for CEO. And then every now and then you get parking reserved for the most important person, our customer. That's a different kind of thinking, a different kind of mentality. So these were some of the kinds of things that they were putting in place in the social compact. Next slide. Look, is that Steve Jobs crying? Steve Jobs crying? Nah. Well, it was the day of the sale. They went to all of the folks at Pixar. They announced to the whole team that they were going to merge with Disney Animation and that they were going to become part of Disney. Well, a lot of the folks at Pixar were concerned, and I think that's why that social compact was so necessary to John and Ed, to reassure the folks at Pixar that nothing was going to change. They were just going to be working for a different boss and have a much bigger ocean to float in. It must have been a relief to Steve Jobs after years of feeding his ugly baby to see it become such a beautiful thing. Getting a marketing partner, getting a corporate partner that understood how they thought. So here you are, sitting at the top of the heap. But what about the other guys? What about those guys at Disney Animation on the day after the sale? Next slide. So on the day after the sale, you see the bullets there. You can only be great if you speak your minds to any colleague, regardless of position, with no fear or repercussions. That came out of the mouth of Ed Catmull directly to all of these other 800 employees at Disney Animation, and reassured them that they wanted to create an open, transparent, candid environment for the creative process. He said, "I do not want Disney Animation to be a clone of Pixar." I think that's significant. Now, John Lasseter, who's sort of the creative genius of the team, was the one who did the heavy lifting in for the presentation to all of the folks at Disney Animation. He made an impassioned speech about the story, about character development, about mutual respect, about being director-driven in animation, and that's what made movies that sprung from people's hearts and connected with the audiences. Folks, just sidebar here, the thing about chapter 12 is all of this was centered around creating an environment that protected and preserved and produced stories and manifested those through characters and movies that enabled people who viewed those movies to connect with them. That's what makes them successful. It starts with that story, and I know all of us have been in the story branding process, so when you create a great story, it makes a Buzz Lightyear really turn into something great. It makes, I've forgotten all the characters right off the top of my head, but I know you all can talk about them and know about some of them. You've taken your kids or grandkids, or you may even have been to the movie. I like this, the last bullet. Maybe now the Disney I wanted to work for when I was a kid will come back. These were the words of someone who was at Disney Animation on the day after the sale many years later to Ed Catmull. That's what he said he was thinking the day that sale went through. He too had a vision of what Disney could be, but they were mired in so much bureaucracy they couldn't be creative. Next slide. Reality sets in and it bites. So Ed Catmull takes a trip to Disney Animation and to their studios, and on the tour with the facilities manager, he observes the work areas have no personality. There's a sense of alienation and fear. People are more concerned about doing the wrong thing than looking for doing the right thing. There's impediments to collaboration. The buildings are not designed right. The floors are in the wrong place. Offices are in the wrong place. There wasn't a spirit of transparency. This is a mindset that's a holdover from the 80s, I think, maybe even the 70s, that hierarchical, I'm in charge, I know what's best for us. And you have Ed Catmull and John Lasseter who are breaking down all of those hierarchical mindsets and paradigms. It can be tough in this generation, 2016, to be able to change the way you do that, but I'm seeing that a lot in the tech sector. So work environments mean a lot. I also recalled back in the 80s, a book came out by a man named Tom Peters, A Passion for Excellence, and he had a principle in that book, a management principle called Management by Wandering Around. And the idea was that the manager or the leader would spend time looking and listening and asking why questions and understanding in order to try to get at what the real issues and the real challenges were. So next slide. Reality sets in and it bites. This is dealing with the people. You know, a tour of Disney Animation by the facilities manager revealed all these things. You know, the work areas, a sense of alienation and fear, which was an emphasis on error prevention, impediments to collaboration because of the building design, transparency, the windows and raised shades. All of that was contributing, the physical insides was contributing to making people who were not productive. So let's do a quick audit. Reality sets in and it bites people. So something wasn't working. Ed Catmull was trying to decide if it was an issue of their ability or was it their teachability. Could they relearn the way the creative process needed to be? He came to the conclusion that they were going to reteach them, all 800 employees at Disney Animation. Solution: institute their version of brain trust at Disney Animation. And if you know from reading the chapter, it's story trust is what they called it. So the mandate in doing that was Pixar and Disney Animation would still remain separate but equal. So here's the things, folks. You see two images there, a crock pot and a microwave. I think Ed and his team, his leadership team, recognized they were going to have to cook a little bit at Disney Animation before they could start microwaving and doing things. They knew that they had to let some of these values and this way of working and getting used to new work environs begin to simmer and to go through the minds and the hearts of these workers so that they could ultimately produce something that tastes good or produce something that people wanted to go see. So that was a key decision, to keep Pixar and Disney Animation separate. This is interesting considering Catmull kept referring to the relationship as a merger. They did not allow Pixar or Disney Animation to do any production for the other. On the surface, this seems incongruent, but as we know, this was a first stage of transition. The change was going to need time to simmer and to cook slowly. Folks, in this generation, we want an app. We want to be able to press things and immediately have what we want. And when it comes to managing people, that does not produce results. Sending emails or throwing cultural grenades over the fence does not solve the problems that companies face. I think we've all probably seen that. Takeaway: sometimes management thinking change requires microwave solutions when a crock pot is necessary. Next slide. The teachable moment. The good employee, but a good employee who may not be the right fit. Some of us may have been in on the employee not being the right fit. I personally, through my younger years, I joined in. I was a good team player, but as I became older, I found out I really needed a different environment. Ergo, self-employed, running my own company, do my own business the way I want to do it. It has high risk, but it sometimes has high reward. So what did they do? This idea of release and retrieve. One leaves and another returns. So they released this guy who couldn't really adapt. He couldn't get out of his set ways in Disney Animation, but then they hired back and retrieved an employee who they had let go as part of their Circle 7 business that they spun off, which was producing sequels of Pixar's movies. And then Anne LeCam, or Com, she was their HR person. He said she had an intellectual curiosity and willingness to adapt. And she came to him with a 2-year plan, and it was very meticulously done, and he had to, in a nice way, say to her, thanks, but no thanks. But he did something. He drew a pyramid. He went through an illustration. You saw it in the book. And he wanted to avoid getting too scriptic or too legislated about the way an organization needed to occur and happen over a 2-year period, and leave it a little bit more on the open side. Interestingly, Anne adapted to that and immediately started changing her own organization in order to make it more fitting for the new environment and the new culture. So what about the story trust on the next slide? Story trust, no more mandatory notes. Can you imagine in your business getting notes from the CEO in addition to other notes and saying, these are things you must do on your project? Nothing will stymie and thwart and just create people who are not empowered than having top-down memos or notes come in and say, you need to do this or you need to do that. Well, they eliminated that. No mandatory notes. 3 sets of notes, was not going to work in this new world that Ed and John Lasseter were creating. Then they did something, an exchange program. They took their directors and animators and producers and editors from Disney Animation to go up and visit Pixar's Brain Trust and to watch what happened. And then the next day, all of the people at Pixar went down to Disney Animation and did the same thing. This was in the fall of 2006. So one of the key things that came out of that was the idea that when you want to improve things, you don't attack people, you attack the project. And it took time for the folks at Disney Animation to understand that. Don't take it personally. We're interested in the project producing. This was 9 months after the merger. So I found that very, very interesting. Next slide, the exchange program. Again, here we have, as I said, the Disney Animation directors went down to Pixar, and Pixar came down to Disney. So John Lasseter, when he visited the folks at, when he came down and visited the folks at Disney Animation, they were in the midst of, they had this movie they were working on, an animated feature called American Dog. And it's interesting. He started off the meeting in their story trust by saying nice things and real positive things. And what happened was, as they came out of that meeting, everybody was beginning to reflect on it and said, you know, that was a really superficial meeting. And one of the people from Disney Animation said, well, you know, John was talking about the project with such glowing terms, we didn't feel like anybody should say anything bad. Light bulb goes on. When people are in an environment where they fear, or they don't like randomness, or they're having a problem with hierarchy, or they're scared they'll lose their job, they just follow in line with leadership just because leadership's there. And John didn't realize that he had inadvertently created a situation where he inhibited feedback. Well, ultimately, that's where the attack, the project, not people, came out of. Part of what occurred in that was the dog that was the American Dog got changed to Bolt. And Bolt was one of the first movies that they produced that had marvelous success. We'll talk about that in a moment. Next slide. Trust is essential. Bear with me, you all. I know we're going, it's a little bit long here, but trust is essential. Contracts undermine trust. It was very clear in the compact that they would have no contracts. It was also clear to the employees of Pixar that they would have no contracts. Now, in my line of business, I have to have contracts with the clients that I serve. It would be nice not to live and work in an environment where I have an employment contract. I think this is one of those things that's unique to the creative management business, but it wouldn't necessarily be applicable across all businesses. Next slide. Solve your own problems. American Dog dies and Bolt emerges. You can see on the slide several statements there. The interesting thing was this project forced both organizations to come to grips with some things, but more importantly forced Disney Animation to deal with the idea that nobody was going to come riding over the hill to bail them out. They changed the name from American Dog to Bolt, and then they did their tests on that, and they went from a 20% favorability to a 90% favorability. But not before John and Ed said, no, you can't go get help. You're going to have to solve this problem yourself. So two of the guys took their 2 weeks of vacation. They spent getting the story right with the riggers. And the riggers are the people apparently that take the animated drawings and turn them into animation. But Bolt was a four-legged creature in the movie, and he needed to turn into a two-legged creature, and so that creates all kinds of challenges. And so you see on the fourth bottom right-hand side there, from a four-legged character to a two-legged would require 6 months of rigging. I realize I'm getting way down in the weeds here, but getting into the weeds is where you find the problems. And this is something that they realized quickly, was they had to force Disney Animation to do its own work, its own way, without going to Pixar for help. And ultimately, it produced people who solved their own problems and ultimately could own their own rewards in that. Next slide. So out of this merger, out of this acquisition, out of this process, John and Ed sort of emerged as this dangerous mythological presence everywhere they went. They were having success. They were creating an environment that was making people happy about what they were doing. But the perception that only John and Ed can solve big problems was present. Ed, I think, recognized that, and John probably as well. So Ed Catmull said it took a while, but the Pixar leadership came to understand that we weren't coming over the hill to save the day. They had to solve the problems. I think for Ed, it took him and John some time to realize the children they'd been raising, symbolically Pixar, but the children they'd been raising in animation, they had answers too. And they needed to be given the opportunity to prove their answers and to gain confidence in that. This can be a hard thing for the creators of a company to embrace. It takes a lot of trust. Next slide, exceptionalism. Remember that compact? Well, the Disney Studios people felt like Pixar's 5-year social contract gave them special treatment. So it was real helpful for Catmull to decide where he was going to land on this. And I think it's interesting that the book tells us that he essentially said, we're going to keep it like it is. Consistency is important across both businesses, but he believed creating smaller, productive work environments within the larger whole was more desirable. And that's what he did. Immersion. Immersion, the key to better products and services. Let's go to New Orleans for research on The Princess and the Frog. The people at Disney Animation felt like they needed to stay in their offices, do what they do, the way they do it, and didn't want to go on a field trip, didn't want to go to New Orleans. But they went, and the ultimate result of that was they had a better, more productive process in developing scenes and understanding the dynamics between the characters, and actually energized the story significantly. But it also, this immersion process, taught them some things about themselves. Taught them that sometimes it's good to not get so immersed that you don't listen to the marketing guys. The marketing guys said, don't use the word princess in the movie. Ed Catmull, John Lasseter, the creative team, nah, we want to go with the Princess and the Frog. So they used that. They opened it. 5 days later, guess who came out with their movie? Avatar, John Cameron. It cooked The Princess and the Frog because now it was just narrowed into only people who were female, little girls, would like the words princess. Whereas if you had taken Avatar out of the picture, it was highly probable that more people would have gone to the movie. So they learned a tough lesson about listening to marketing, but also balancing that with the creative process. I thought that was significant. Lessons learned. They come along again. They're working on a movie called Rapunzel, and they decided that it needed a new name to promote it the way they wanted to promote it, and ultimately marketing said, let's change it to Tangled. And that, you all know, is one of the key Disney animation successes. And so in the production of that movie, it was the first hit in 16 years for Disney Animation. So what do you think the